Let's give every creature Deathtouch. This is Zagras, Thief of Heartbeats. Zagras is a legendary vampire rogue for 4 colorless, a black, and a red mana, and it costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. But here's the best part. Not only does Zagras have flying, Deathtouch, and haste, on the card it says, other creatures you control have Deathtouch. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. Today, I'll show you a 100-card commander deck that I've built around Zagras, with the goal of being both fun and powerful. I've broken down the 2 colors, red and black, into 3 subsections. The first subsection is, how do we move fast? How do we bide our time and start to ramp up in colors that are not traditionally known for ramp? The second subsection is the party mechanic. How do we get the most out of the text on Zagras that says, for each creature in your party, this costs 1 less? The third subsection, and by far the largest, is scary stuff, mostly creatures. Now, I've tried to limit the creatures in the deck to primarily rogues, wizards, warriors, and clerics, which satisfy the party requirement, but I've also thrown in some shapeshifters and wacky characters that are sure to keep things spicy. Plus, we'll have some vampire and warrior synergies that should be very easy to trigger with our commander's creature types. And of course, we also have some special lands and artifacts in order to complement the existing synergies in the deck and to make it a little easier to move fast and get things out of your graveyard, regardless of what colors you already have on the board. Let's jump right into it. Red is traditionally known as a fast, hasty color, so let's start with black when it comes to the first subsection, moving quickly. Here, I've selected 6 cards. 3 creatures, 1 sorcery, 1 enchantment, and 1 instant. The instant is Dark Ritual, a familiar card in the format which allows you to play 1 black mana and turn it into 3. This could allow you to play things in turn 1 that would normally be completely unavailable to you. This almost goes without further explanation. However, I do think keeping in mind our commander without the party synergy requires a good deal, 6 mana value. This can help us get there just in case. Next up, we have Greed, an enchantment for 3 colorless and 1 black, and it says, pay 1 black and 2 life to draw a card. This is, again, a great way early in the game when you only have 4 mana to get some extra cards in your hand to play your commander faster. In addition, this is a replayable card draw in black. Whenever we're looking for black staples, we want to make sure it's mana and card draw for this deck specifically, since we won't need help on the Deathtouch, and we most likely will have flying and haste from the other categories. Okay, let's move on to our final non-creature black card in our 3rd subsection. So we have Skulltap, 1 colorless and 1 black for a sorcery, and it says, as an additional cost to play Skulltap, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. Now, this is not super optimized, but it's a very easy card to play, right? There's going to be mostly creatures in the deck, and you will most likely have ways to get them back. Now, Graveyard Recursion is not a huge theme in the deck, but in black, this is a great option to play. This is one of those few areas where a 2-mana sorcery just goes over the line. I feel like this makes it worth it, and we'll see more as we go along. To go to our first creatures in black, we have Merrow Bonegnawer for 1 black. It's a 1/1 Merfolk Rogue, so that is already one of the 4 types we need in order to get our commander out for cheaper. And it says, whenever you play a black spell, you may untap Merrow Bonegnawer. At any time, tap it. Target player removes a card in his or her graveyard for the game, shutting down so many dredge decks or other exile from graveyard mechanics. This is something that's just a nice thing to have. It's a sort of specific niche removal that comes up a lot in this format, and it might even help you when you least expect it with that untap ability, just as an extra Deathtouch blocker. Whenever you play a black spell, you may untap it. Maybe you don't need that graveyard synergy, but someone might not expect you to have a Dark Ritual in your hand, for example. That will untap this. It'll have Deathtouch if your commander's out, and there you go, a surprise untapper. So it's sort of 2 niche removals. While it just looks like a creature for 1, it carries a lot more weight than that. And let's go to our second creature, Zhentarim Bandit, for 1 colorless and a black. It's a halfling rogue with 2/1. It says whenever it attacks, you may pay 1 life and create a treasure token. This is sort of an interesting ability that you might not get the most out of, but is certainly super useful, especially the more players you have or the more demand you have for colors that are not in your opening hand. And now we have our final black creature for our third subsection, Jarl of the Forsaken. It's 3 colorless and a black for a 3/2 zombie cleric. It has flash, but at 4 mana, it's maybe not something you're playing early on, so why is it in the deck? Well, it has Foretell for 1 and a black. During your turn, you may pay 2 colorless, exile it from your hand, and then foretell it in. Boom, you have a very clever way to bring in a cleric, flash in a defender for 3/2, maybe even if you already have your commander out, do a lot at once. And on top of that, it says, when Jarl of the Forsaken enters the battlefield, destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. So even if you're not able to flash and/or foretell it in to destroy someone at combat time, you can still try to use the removal part either from your hand or, if you did have the chance, from the foretell. So before, after, during combat, this is a really good option. So all of these black cards are pretty integral to getting a good head start on the game, or if you get them mid to late game, they can still give you that extra edge that your opponent probably won't see coming. Okay, now let's head into the red cards in this subsection of quick gameplay and ramping mana. Devil's Play. For X in a red, it's a sorcery that says Devil's Play deals X damage to target creature or player, and it has flashback for X red, red, red. You may cast it from the graveyard for its flashback cost, then exile it. So this is a fantastic early game targeted removal, or you could even target the player later on in the game, especially for its flashback ability in case you need a finishing blow. So this is useful. Admittedly, at sorcery speed, it's a little limiting, but because of its cheap cost in a dual color deck, this could be helpful. And by the end of the game, with special lands, artifacts, and other synergies, hopefully that red, red, red for the flashback won't come back to bite you. So this is helpful for early and late game removal. And if you only have red, it could be even more useful. Next, we have Thrill of Possibility, a red staple card that costs 1 colorless and 1 red. It's an instant. As an additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards. That's pretty much all you need to know about Thrill of Possibility. Let's move into Riveteers Requisitioner. This is 1 colorless and a red for a creature, Viashinu Rogue. So when it dies, not only do you create a treasure token, but you can cast this for its blitz cost. It'll have haste. You sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, and when it dies, you draw a card. So it's a 3/1 that has a lot of bonuses. That treasure token's good for that dual color ramp, but if you blitz it, you get a treasure token, and you get a card draw, and you get a 3/1 with haste. It's a rogue, which can synergize with your commander, so if you play your commander when you're blitzing it, you can get quite a lot of benefits. But the blitz is 2 colorless and a red, more expensive than it is to play traditionally. So that's most likely because you're obviously getting that extra card draw, that extra benefit. It's essentially a little bit of bang for your buck, an extra bonus bang. Next, we have Brighthearth Banneret for 1 colorless and a red. It's an elemental warrior, 1/1. It says elemental spells and warrior spells you play cost 1 less to play. And it has reinforced 1 colorless and a red, discard, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. So this is a nice way to synergize with some of the other warriors. That's one of those creature types that ends up being more expensive. There's a lot of them in the deck. There's a couple we'll go through, especially in red, that could use from a little bit of discount, especially with kickers or blitz costs. And that 1/1 counter is something that on your commander, especially since he starts off at 4/4, can put him into that next tier. A 5/5 flying Deathtouch is way scarier than a 4/4. So that's a nice one. Being an elemental warrior itself, it lends itself to a little bit of party synergies, but it's not the most integral part of the synergy chain in the deck. Next, we have Mayhem Patrol, 1 colorless and a red for a Devil Warrior, 1/2. It has Menace, and whenever it attacks, target creature gets 1/0 until end of turn. You'd imagine, again, you can bump up your commander to 5/4, or you can also play this for 1 colorless and red for its blitz cost. It gains haste. When it dies, draw a card, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So this is a great way to make 2 defenders die if you have Deathtouch, even if this guy's only a 2/2, because you boost yourself. But in case you have other creatures out there on the battlefield, you can boost them up. So with or without Deathtouch, they're getting right over that line. In the extra card draw, this time for the exact same cost, 1 colorless and a red to play normally or blitz, I mean, that's a really good compromise. So whenever you're playing this warrior, you're going to have a good time. And if you even have a discount from that previous card, the Banneret we previewed, then that's even better. Next up, we have Goblin Cratermaker for 1 colorless and a red. It's a Goblin Warrior creature for 2 attack, 2 toughness. Its ability is 1 colorless, sacrifice it, choose 1. It deals 2 damage to target creature, so great instant removal, or destroy target colorless non-land permanent. That's very specific, but also very useful. A lot of colorless permanents would be artifacts. Almost all of them are going to be artifacts, and that's going to let you, similar to that other card we previewed in red, that'll let you take down things that your opponent has that you might not have other answers for. It's pretty rare to have a destroy target artifact card, and you would want to have a little more written on the text. And since this is a warrior 2/2, and it has the ability to destroy, let's say, an artifact, equipment, etc., or deal 2 damage to target creature, that gives you a lot in your arsenal. And of course, if it has Deathtouch, when it deals 2 damage to target creature, that'll kill it no matter what. So don't forget the Deathtouch synergies. If a card says that it deals damage, especially first strike, that's going to get you in for way more impact. Next, we have Priest of Urabrask for 2 colorless and a red. It's a 2/1 human cleric. When it enters the battlefield, add red, red, red to your mana pool. Remember, that's the flashback cost for the card we saw at the beginning of this block. And also, in addition, red, red, red is essentially half the cost of your commander. Admittedly, that 1 black mana might be hard to get, but it's something that is going to be super beneficial and might let you do all sorts of other synergies with expensive red cards in the deck. Very good to have that flashback cost, again, tied to this Priest of Urabrask ability. Those are just 2 cards that are really nice to have together in the same deck. Next, we have Vaultbreaker for 3 colorless and a red. It's an Orc Rogue for 2. Whenever it attacks, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. We see a lot of this in red and a lot of this in this ramp category for this deck. It also has a dash ability for 2 and a red. It gets haste, and you return it to your hand instead of discarding it. You actually get to attack with it, do the discard and draw, and then put it back in your hand instead of destroying it. Somewhat more comparable to, like, let's say, a ninjutsu. And that's just super appealing. And the dash is, of course, cheaper because of this compromise you have. In a way, this seems like one of the best dash cards in the deck. 2 colorless, 1 red, 4/2, attack, discard, draw, bounce it back to your hand so no one can remove it after the fact, play it again. Almost every turn, it becomes a renewable source of card draw if you don't need it for, of course, its Deathtouch attack when your commander's on the battlefield. Next up, we have Chandra, Fire Artisan, a Planeswalker, of course, for 2 colorless and a red, red. It starts off with 4 loyalty counters, and it says, whenever a loyalty counter is removed from Chandra, she deals that much damage to target opponent or Planeswalker. That's 1 or more, so you're not going to get separate triggers. Its +1 is exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn. And its -7 is exile the top 7 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. So more card draw. Of course, it's expensive, but it's also very, very attention stealing. Now, if your commander is out there at 4 attack, 4 defense, and Chandra's out there, and she starts with 4 loyalty counters, that's a pretty important number there. That means that your opponents are most likely going to have a hard time deciding who to take care of. The person that gives you infinite card draw as long as she remains on the board, or the person that gives you infinite Deathtouch as long as he remains on the board. I like this as a mid-level expensive way. Those red pips do cost a little extra, but we did just see the Priest of Urabrask and some other ways to ramp. Hopefully this is a competitive, mid to more expensive way to give more targets and also give you card draw when you need it, whenever that is in the game. Okay, we have Flamerush Rider for 4 colorless and a red. It's a human warrior 3/3. Whenever it attacks, put a token on the battlefield tapped and attacking. That's a copy of another target attacking creature. Exile the token at the end of combat. It has dash for 2 colorless and a red red. So the dash here is a little cheaper, but more expensive on the red side. So I would imagine you would almost always want to play this for the dash. It's 3/3, maybe with Deathtouch, and it lets you copy almost any other creature. Now keep in mind, you can't copy legendary creatures, as the legendary rule and commander means those will go away once they enter the battlefield. Of course, if they have some type of interesting enter the battlefield, in our case, they don't. Flamerush Rider just seems like one of the best and most powerful cards in this deck, especially towards the end of the game. And of course, because it's more expensive, you're probably not going to be using this principally for ramp, but because it copies other creatures and it's only 4 on the dash and you bounce it, I'm including it in this deck. It helps you go fast, right? And sometimes going fast means leveraging cards you already have, and if you only have one version of them that you don't want to get rid of, this lets you copy that, dispose of that version either way, bounce this back, and repeat that action over and over again, which means maybe even repeated card draw if you have a Priest of Urabrask again. So lots of really, really interesting ways to use Flamerush Rider. Yes, it is a scary card, but I think it's more important in this subsection, moving fast. And it looks fast. I mean, just look at those flames coming off the back of it. Okay, for our final red card in this subsection of moving fast and ramping, we have Akoum Warrior. It's a double-sided card. It's 5 colorless and a red for a Minotaur Warrior with Trample. It's a 4/5, which could be very, very good if you're towards the end of the game. Trample and Deathtouch go very nicely together as you're going to kill any defenders. You can essentially assign 1 damage to each one if multiple blockers are assigned. Kill all of them, maybe even still get through, since you can say if there's 3 defenders, it does 4 damage. I do 1 damage to each of the 3 defenders, 1 directly. I mean, that's fantastic. But on the backside, it's Akoum Teeth, which is a land that enters the battlefield tapped and just produces 1 red. Now, obviously, I prefer the lands that don't enter tapped, but here, because it's a warrior, which could be super beneficial for a little bit more party synergies, because it has trample, and because 5 colorless and 1 red is something you might be happy to pay later on in the game, but that 1 mana tapped might be something you desperately need earlier on in the game. This comes full circle and feels like a great card, perhaps one that could be a little more powerful, but I love to have it. I love anything that has a land on the back. Okay, and that's it for this subsection of ramp and moving fast. Let's now move into the second subsection, which is party mechanics. We're trying to get the most out of our clerics, rogues, warriors, and wizards. Let's start off with black again. Surprisingly enough, we still have only 6 cards, and we'll go in order of least to most expensive yet again. We'll start off with the Skeletal Changeling. Love the artwork on these cards, and it's a changeling, which means it's every creature type at all times. Now, because the party mechanic needs 4 independent creatures, you can only use this to fill in 1 of your empty spots. However, that's normally super useful, and its activated ability is 1 colorless and 1 black to regenerate the Skeletal Changeling. Now, that's the same as the casting cost. 1 colorless, 1 black, 1/1. Can you believe that? This is just one of those linchpin cards. Whenever you get it, you're going to be happy to see it. It has almost no cons except for the fact that you might not have that black mana sometimes. Obviously, you'd want to mulligan if that's the case. Hopefully, you'll have some way to produce that, and you'll be able to get this guy out early on, fill in whatever blank you have. Let's move on to Oona's Blackguard. This is 1 colorless and a black for a fairy rogue, 1/1. It's flying, super useful. Each other rogue creature you control comes into play with an additional 1/1 counter on it. That includes your commander. Whenever a creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. Super scary. So this could almost go into the scary category, but because of its roguishness and because of its boost ability with your commander to give it a 1/1 counter and then make other creatures scary, I see it more as a core party synergy element. Also, flying is something that you might need, especially in a deck that exclusively features flying creatures. This deck does not necessarily care about flying normally, so to have this there to block someone, hopefully with your commander by its side, super helpful. Next up, we have Malakir Blood-Priest for 1 colorless and a black. It's a Vampire Cleric 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures in your party. Very nice. It's not going to be super synergistic in this deck because you can only do 4 damage, right? You can only really have up to 4 creatures in your party, but it's nice to get that extra hit in, get through any blockers, and you have 2 attack, which will be nice with the Deathtouch. I mean, if you think about your commander getting through with flying, if they don't have flying blockers, this immediately means you'll have 8 going through, 4 of which is commander damage on your turn, right? You play this out, then you play your commander out for a little cheaper, and your commander has haste, you swing with that. This has the triggered damage, and I mean, that's not a bad turn. Next up, we have Deadly Alliance for 4 colorless and a black. It's an instant. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party, and it says destroy target creature or planeswalker. So if you have the full party, it's only 1 black to destroy any creature or planeswalker. Very, very nice. Not much else to say about this. You really don't want to play it until you have to. It's an instant speed, so very little downside to that one. Very happy with that card. Next up, we have Coveted Prize for 4 colorless and a black. A sorcery. It also costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. This time you search your library for a card. That's right, tutor. Put it in your hand, then shuffle. If you have a full party, amazing, you may cast a spell with converted mana cost 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. So sorcery speed is the only downside of this, I'd say. Again, full party means you're only paying 1 black mana to tutor. And not only tutor, but if it's 4 or less, play it for free. But you don't have that as a restriction. That's just an extra benefit. It doesn't say you have to do anything if it ends up being more expensive than that. So you really can search for any card for any reason. Love it. And the final black card in this category, again, the category is Party Mechanic in Crucial Synergies. So we have Thwart the Grave for 4 colorless and a black sorcery. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. Return target creature card and up to 1 target Cleric, Rogue, Warrior, or Wizard card from your graveyard to the battlefield, directly to the battlefield. That means it costs only black to bring whatever you want back. It could be your commander. It could be some scary trample creature like the Akoum warrior. It could be a creature where it hasn't entered the battlefield effectively. We were just talking about the Blood-Priest that enters and can do 4 damage. This is one of the few times that we have the party and the graveyard recursion that we've been looking for. Wish we could have more cards like this in the deck. Truly an amazing high-cost card, but technically it's kind of super cheap. 2 black if you have a full party. I would just hang on to it till that point in the game. And that ties up our black cards for this category. Let's head right into the red ones. Unlike our last category, we only have 6 reds, same as black. Let's start off with the Firebelly Changeling. This is 1 colorless and red for a creature shapeshifter, 1/1. It's a changeling, and its activated ability is 1 red for Firebelly Changeling, gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Play this ability no more than twice each turn, so you can make it at most a 3/1 changeling. Just a nice card. Very nice to have. Obviously, you can't always rely on having your commander out, so making it 3/1 just to, get someone scared, that's good. Beyond that, I just see this as putting your party a little bit ahead of pace. Filling in those gaps, filling in where you might not have that wizard, something like that. Okay, Grotag Bug-Catcher for 1 colorless and a red. This is a Goblin Warrior, 1/2 trample. Whenever Grotag Bug-Catcher attacks, it gets 1/0 until end of turn for each creature in your party. Wow, so that could go all the way up to being a 5/2 warrior trample, and of course, Deathtouch if your commander's out there. Just steal at 2 mana. Really think that's a great card. It does seem like there's a lot of warriors out there, but that's just how it has to be, right? Next up, we have Ardent Electromancer for 2 colorless and a red, a human wizard 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, add red for each creature in your party. That's right, you could add up to 4 red mana. This is already a wizard. Very nice to have the wizard, because that's one of the harder creature types to get in the deck. But boom, just wow. I can't even think, 4 red mana. That's essentially all of the red cards in the deck. Nothing's ever going to cost more than that in terms of red pips. So this is just an amazing linchpin. This is both ramp and party synergy. Love it for only 3 mana. I really think this is one of those cards you might return back to the battlefield, do whatever you need with at any point in the game. Very impressed with this card. Okay, next up we have Thundering Spark Mage for 3 colorless and a red. It's a human wizard 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, where X is the number of creatures in your party. So we've seen that effect before a little bit with the Blood-Priest. Of course, you don't gain life here, but you can target and remove something. Of course, you're paying 3 colorless and a red, and you can only really deal 4 damage, so that's 1 mana per damage, not the best rate, but it still is a wizard 2/2, so it's one of those nice-to-haves. One of those where you kind of want the party synergy to be there if you're going to play it, and you might discard this for Thrill of Possibility if it's early in the game, but it's a nice card to have to discard. It's a nice card to have that's great later, but you don't care about earlier on. Next up, we have the Warspike Changeling for 3 colorless and a red. It's a Shapeshifter 3/3 Changeling. Its activated ability is 1 red for Warspike Changeling, gains first strike until end of turn, which is amazing. As we said before, first strike means with Deathtouch, you'll be able to kill anybody without them being able to do damage unless they also have first strike or double strike. So a 3/3 that kills anything, sign me up. That means 11/11s, 12/12s, no big deal. You'll be able to kill them and survive until the next turn. The sacrifice here is clearly the 3 colorless and a red to play it, but I'm not too concerned. Obviously, this is one of those cards that you don't need if you're earlier on in the game. Flying Deathtouch haste on your commanders, probably that competitive edge. You don't necessarily need first strike. You can discard this to throw a possibility and just wait a little while, maybe return it back to the battlefield using that, one graveyard card that we've seen. Okay, now for the final red card in this category, we have Shatterskull Minotaur for 4 colorless and a red. Minotaur Warrior, 5/4. It costs 1 less to cast for every creature in your party. Love to see it, otherwise, my god, this would be expensive. And it has haste. So 5/4, maybe with the discount, only 2 red pips. I mean, very nice. I would recommend not playing it earlier on in the game, clearly. But this is going to do some serious damage. At 5 attack, this is just a very good, scary card. You do wish you had more flash and more abilities to do damage to people, and so just having this thing in your back pocket makes you feel a little better. Okay, time for the next subsection, big, scary things. Now that we have our mana ramped, now that we've moved quickly, now that we maybe have our commander out, how do we win the game? Obviously, we have some really nice options already. If we have a board full and no one's board wiped, no one's removed our linchpins, but how do we give people something else to be concerned about? Something besides Chandra and Zagras to remove on site? What are we doing when the game gets to 8, 9, 10 turns and we have all this mana sitting around? And what are some of those special lands and artifacts that'll come after this subsection that we'll also use to get a little bit of extra surprise and a little bit of extra fun out of our games? Let's start off, as usual, with black. So our only 1 black card is Deviant Glee. It's an enchantment aura. It's actually multicolor because it says enchant creature. It gets +2/+1 and has pay 1 red mana. This creature gains trample until end of turn. So 1 black mana in order to boost your creature to the next level. So again, commander at 4 would go up to 6 and be a 6/5. Fine, pretty scary. But then giving someone trample for an extra red. Again, that's later on in the game, doesn't have to be the same turn. That is terrific. We've mentioned this before. If you have any amount of damage, distributing the Deathtouch trample is one of the best things to do. It's almost a board wipe if people are scared of dying. If they have to block you because of a low life total, especially with your commander being the one throwing the damage down, this might win the game. Only 1 mana, 2 later on. Wow, really great. Next, Soul Strings. X colorless in a black for a sorcery. Return 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand unless any player pays X. Wow. Now that is pretty good. Admittedly, you'll need to time it up. It's a sorcery, so if you're playing against a blue player, this might be very hard to do, but depending on the right time and the right opponent, ideally earlier on in the game when maybe you've had to defend with some creatures you didn't want to, or maybe if you've put your commander in the graveyard because you're just assuming you'll have a way to get him back, bam, there you go. I'd say it's pretty great. I mean, if you pay only 1 X and 1 black because they have all tapped mana, that's only 2 mana for 2 creature cards right from the graveyard to your hand. Seems like a really good use case. Highly recommend using that at any point in the game, but particularly earlier on, it is nice. Next up, we have Headhunter, 1 colorless and a black, 1/1 cleric. Great to have the little bit of party synergy the cleric has, but what's really scary is not only does it say whenever Headhunter deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card from their hand, it also has Morph. You may play this face down as a 2/2 for 3, turn it up anytime for 1 black. Ouch. Does remind me again of a ninjutsu like from Kamigawa. You could be attacking with someone and morph it, make them discard a card. So brutal. Something that gives people something to be concerned about besides your commander. You really don't want to let this guy through. And if your commander's out, then it has Deathtouch, and they still don't want to let it through, but now it's going to be creature removal or card removal from their hand. So puts people in a very tough position. I usually avoid putting powerful counterspells and powerful discard or reveal hand cards in these commander decks. I'm looking for more fun and less competitiveness, but this is one of those things that you almost don't want it to happen, right? You want to put this out there and you want someone to have a way to remove it so it wastes their removals or counters, and then you can play something a little more full of value later on. So this is supposed to be a little bit of a red herring. I don't actually foresee people keeping this out there for so many turns that it becomes a serious threat, but it's supposed to look scary and it's supposed to feel like something that people really would prefer to make a deal about or completely annihilate, right? Instead of have it sit there and essentially be one of the more cheap Deathtouch scary guys. Next, we have Morgue Theft, a sorcery for a colorless and a black. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and it has flashback for 4 colorless and a black. Great. We'll see the next card's also very similar to this. One of the best parts about this is you can play it earlier on or later on. Grim Harvest for 1 colorless and a black. Instant, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and it has recover for 2 colorless and a black. When a creature is put into your graveyard from play, you may pay 2 in a black. If you do, return this card from your graveyard to your hand. Otherwise, remove this card from the game. So it's a little bit more restrictive than flashback, but it's still something that you might get extra plays out of and might be really crucial. Instant speed means this actually could be leveraged with a dash or a flash mechanic very nicely. Keep that in mind. I would highly suggest using this with a card that already has a benefit for entering the battlefield or allows you to use that instantness of it, right? A sorcery and an instant are going to have vastly different use cases, and with the recover ability, you might want to leave enough mana open to play it on their turn and then immediately on your turn, or depending on what happens based on that combat sequence. Next up, we have Gatekeeper of Malakir for 2 black. It's kind of restrictive there already. It's a Vampire Warrior 2/2, and it has kicker black. So you might be paying black, black, black for this. That's a lot. But it says when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, target player sacrifices a creature. So we're not necessarily going to kick this, right? It's a warrior. It's also a vampire, and we'll see that there's a little bit of nice vampire synergies that we can use in our deck. But it's mostly just there to present a concern, right? If a opponent knows you have graveyard recursion, if an opponent knows that you have a dark ritual, there you go. This is just 1 dark ritual away from blasting away whatever creature they choose. So it's not one of the most powerful cards, but it's definitely something that you will like to have. Next, we have a classic, Audacious Thief for 2 colorless and a black. A human rogue, 2/2. When it attacks, you draw a card and lose a life. Wonderful. 1 life really is meaningless in Commander. I do not think you're going to mind that unless you're at the very end of the game. In drawing a card every time you attack, especially if this guy has some extra bonuses, we've already seen ways to give creatures Deathtouch, Trample, First Strike. There you go. This is one of those cards that, middle of the game, it's going to be just so perfect. Again, though, at 2 colorless and a black, probably want to avoid it early in the game. It's just going to get removed if someone sees it. They obviously, no matter who they are, no opponent is going to want you to draw cards, especially with a card that's pretty recognizable at common level like this. So be careful with it. This card is scary because of the card draw, and that's why I don't put it in the mana ramp card draw category. At 2 colorless and a black, in the fact that you need to attack to draw with it, I really don't think it deserves to be in the fast ramp section. And because people will remove it so quickly, again, this is more of one of those scary cards. One of those cards you should wait to play, and when you play it, you'll get a lot out of it. Next up, we have Viconia Dro Apostate for 2 colorless and a black, an Elf Cleric 2/3. It is a legendary creature, so keep that in mind. You can't make a copy of it. And it says, at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, return a creature card at random from your graveyard to your hand. So I've complained about the graveyard recursion in this deck before. There's a decent amount. It's a little opinionated whether there's not enough or too much, I suppose. I sort of think there could be more. So although this card is not super valuable, although when's the likelihood you're going to have 4 creature cards in your graveyard? That's probably going to only be later on in the game, or as a worst case scenario if you've just been discarding like a maniac. So This is one of those sort of safety valves, right? This is one of those creatures that towards the middle or end of the game, it presents a big target for your opponents if they see that your graveyard is stacked, right? But other than that, it's just good for the clericness. It's just good for the fact that you know that the longer it's there, the better it gets, right? It gets scarier the longer it's on the board. But similar to the Audacious Thief, be careful when you play this, right? You play it earlier on, it's practically useless. You play it later on in the game when the board is crowded, could be very good, but only if you have creatures in your graveyard. So at 2 colorless and a black, I don't really think this is too expensive to cut, but it's on the line. I would definitely prefer to see less of a limitation. 4 is a lot, even just 3 would be better. But this is great. Another area that allows for creativity in gameplay and maybe upgradability if somebody prefers to have a more expensive card in this deck. Next up, we have Blind Zealot for 1 colorless, black. It's a human cleric 2/2 with Intimidate, which means it can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and/or creatures that share a color with it, in this case, black. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it. If you do, destroy target creature that player controls. Very, very good. So immediately off the bat, it's hard to block. That's nice, just 2 damage every turn. But if they have an artifact or if they have a black creature, then okay, hopefully you'll have your commander out. And it still does some serious removal, even if you don't deal combat damage to a player and use its sacrifice removal ability. So there you go. Cleric, 2 strategies for removal, but if not, you're pinging them for 2 every turn. I'm digging it. Next up, we have Poison the Cup for 1 colorless, black. Again, it's an instant. Destroy target creature. If this spell was foretold, scry 2. Its foretell is 2 colorless. Exile this card from your hand face down. Cast it later on for foretell of 1 colorless and a black. Okay, so I think scrying 2 in this deck is pretty good. Obviously, the mana requirements, some of the cards is requiring 2 pips of a certain color, means that scry 2 earlier on in the game, very, very good. And the foretell cost gives you a discount on those colored pips. It's 1 black normal. Foretell is only 1 black. So I just think this is versatile. Obviously, destroy target creature. It's nice to play that later on if perhaps the Deathtouch is not enough. Scrying is good earlier on if you're looking for that answer. But overall, this is just another piece of the puzzle. I really think that having multiple foretell cards also adds replayability to your deck, right? If people see a face down card and it could be a morph, it could be a foretell. Well, actually, the morph and foretell, you should probably mark those on your battlefield, but people will be a little bit curious. What's under that? Is it going to be a Poison the Cup or is it going to be a creature? That's always nice to have. So one of those cool synergies, one of those cool ways to build up a little bit of a theme with the deck. Next up, we have potentially my favorite card in terms of this category, maybe in the deck in general. We have Crypt Rats for 2 colorless and a black. Wow. So this is a rat creature, 1/1. Its activated ability is you pay X. Crypt Rat deals X damage to each creature and player. Spend only black mana in this way. Holy crap. Once you have the mana to cast this, wait till your commander is out, and it's a board wipe, right? Since the commander gives every creature Deathtouch, and since this deals damage from the Crypt Rats to every single creature, and you're always going to have 1 black mana because it costs 2 colorless and a black to cast it. This is beyond a doubt one of the more fun board wipes to put out there. Crypt Rats will even take itself out. It'll even take your commander out with it. It'll take everyone out with it. And it'll probably make everybody really concerned as to what else you have in store. If you've planned this out and it's later on in the game, you could use this as a really cool big turn, right? You play Crypt Rats early on, you wipe everybody, and you can do this all before combat even takes place. Really cool. Huge fan of Crypt Rats. Next, we have Vengeful Reaper for 3 colorless and a black. It's an angel cleric with, oh wow, flying, Deathtouch, haste, and foretell. During your turn, pay 2 colorless, exile it, cast it later for 1 colorless and a black. 2/3. It's very similar to the commander itself. It's got flying, it's got haste, it's got Deathtouch. And if you have a bunch of other creatures out there, this almost is a secondary commander, right? This is one of those creatures that at 2/3, and your commander's at 4/4, both of them swinging in, ouch! that hurts. That's 6 damage. That doesn't take very long for people to really run out of answers, right? If you have this flying guy out, and you have the intimidating guy out, and you have maybe a flash or another foretell out, you're going to have a diverse and very hard to deal with board state. I do think it's a little expensive at 3 colorless and a black, so you'll want to do the foretell and play it earlier on before the commander most likely, but later on in the game, it's a very scary card. Just having a copy of your commander just at a little bit of a cheaper cost and a little bit of a cheaper attack and toughness, I think that's a pretty decent thing to have. Next up, we have Balduvian Dead for 3 colorless and a black as well. It's a zombie for 2/3. And its activated ability is the thing we're looking for here. It's 2 colorless and a red. Remove a creature card in your graveyard from the game. Put a 3/1 black and red Graveborn creature token with haste into play. Sacrifice it at the end of turn. So, what are we going to do with this? First of all, this is something you want to play later on in the game, almost exclusively. Earlier on in the game, you don't know if you're going to get some graveyard recursion. You don't know exactly how you're going to build up your party and cast your commander. But later on in the game, with enough mana to activate that ability twice, it's only 2 colorless and a red, so if you can activate that more than once, there's nothing saying you only have to do it a couple times per turn. You could activate it 3, 4 times, put in so many hasty 3/1 death touches with almost no consequence. And the sacrifice at the end of turn instead of at end of combat means that you could technically sacrifice them as the cost to play other spells. You could throw those creatures under the bus in some other capacity, and you can even create them on, let's say, your opponent's turn as a defender, so you don't really have to worry about the whole what am I going to do with them later on question. You can do whatever you want. They last until the end of your turn. Next, we have Smoldering Butcher for 3 colorless and a black. It's an elemental warrior 4/2 with, get this, Wither. It deals damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. Love it. So if you have this out at the same time as your commander, it raises an interesting question, right? Either way, their creatures are probably going to die. Whether it's this turn or next turn, it's tough. Those -1/-1 counters are tough to deal with. It makes them weaker targets for removal, weaker targets for blocking, but also at the same time out as your commander, it means that they don't know exactly who to remove. Even if they remove your commander, this is still going to do some bad withering damage, and it's also 4 attack. Both of them are 4 attack. Very tricky. And then, of course, if it's out there at a different time as your commander, that's very, very nice. You know, not all these creatures say Deathtouch on them, but Wither is almost better because it can block multiple people and do lots of interesting long-term damage to them, as long as it doesn't get destroyed itself, or, you know, maybe you could bring it back if that does happen. Next up, we just have 2 more in black. We have Cabal Executioner. Might have heard of this one. It's 2 colorless and a black for a cleric 2/2. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player sacrifices a creature. Wow. I love this a lot more than the Headhunter, where you'd be discarding cards. This one, a lot more fun. If they let it through, it sacrifices a creature, so you should just block it, right? And not only that, it has Morph. Though the Morph is a little interesting, so you play it face down as a creature, 2/2 creature for 3, then turn it face up at any time, pretty hard to counter, but for 3 colorless and a black, very expensive, 5 mana value. That is a lot, but since you know that you might be getting through ninjutsu style, that's just an automatic target player sacrifices a creature without even having to target that player. So I just really think this card is scary, it's expensive, but it's almost a win condition because once you start to get later on in the game, you have flying, you have Deathtouch, now you're sacrificing their creatures, you're going to start really making them run out of options, hopefully. And our final black card, I'd say probably one that's more on the fun and less on the, pure power side. It's the Underdark Explorer for 4 colorless and a black, a lizard warrior, 5/3. Yes, nice, 5/3, but oh no, 4 colorless and a black, that's a lot. What does it say? It says Menace. When it enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. So I just like this as a fun thing to do later on in the game. If you're looking for an extra way to get that oomph to get that winning strike in. I think taking the initiative and having Menace, two great ways to do it. Menace means that they're going to have to block with 2 or more creatures. Those will probably die if your commander's out. When you take the initiative, you immediately, the first thing you do is you search for a land card. Later on in the dungeon, you can give 1/1 counters, you can scry, you can deal direct damage to a player. At the very end, you can put all these 1/1 counters on stuff. So I just think that's a way to have a fun commander card that gives you bonuses and makes its cost feel decent. You're not really getting as much as the other cards, but it gives you something that other players might never have, right? Similar to the Monarch, maybe initiative hasn't even entered into the game. Now people are vying for it. When you deal direct damage to another player, you immediately take the initiative from them and enter the dungeon or go to the next room. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have the initiative, then you also go to the next room. So a lot of really fun extra things that can happen. Highly recommend it. Okay, time to head into the red cards of the scary stuff subsection. First, we have Imposing Visage, or Visage, for 1 red. It's an enchantment. I'm pretty sure it's an enchant aura. Target creature cannot be blocked by only 1 creature. So, Menace. You immediately give anybody Menace on your battlefield for only 1 red mana. What else is there to say? You most likely want to wait till the commander's out, so that's a Deathtouch, but you don't have to. I don't really understand how this card can be that good, but it just is. It just is that good. Next, we have Battlefield Scavenger for 1 colorless and a red. It's a Jackal Rogue 2/2. You may exert it as it attacks, which means it won't untap during your next untap step. You'll have to wait a turn. And then whenever you exert a creature, this is the only one in the deck, so keep that in mind, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So I mentioned before, I like a diversity of mechanics, keep opponents and yourself sort of, off their pace, give you something to think about, something that makes the deck fun to play more than once. But also, I mean, you don't have to exert it. It's a 2/2 rogue, which means that maybe you'll be doing some party stuff with it. But if you do choose to exert it and discard a card, draw a card, that's great. And you can do that after you wait another turn. So it's a little bit of recurring discard draw. Why would somebody necessarily want to remove this? It doesn't present much of a concern. I feel like most opponents, if they see this out there earlier on in the game, 1 colorless, 1 red, it's not that huge of a target. They probably won't remove it, but they'll attack and expect you to block or something like that. So I think it's a great card to have that can give you some extra bonuses, give you some extra card draw. Maybe this should have gone into the move fast, but because you exert, I'm not expecting you to move this fast. It's one of those slippery cards, right? It's slippery. It kind of fits into all 3 categories, but I think you're mostly going to get the value out of this by the fact that it's a distraction. It gives you this sort of sneaky card draw, and you can probably keep it out there for almost the entire game, and that's scary. So this one, maybe I should make a 4th category of, hey, it fits into all of them, but I decided to put it in this final one also because this last category is the biggest one. It has the most cards that can be used for the most different circumstances, and you could also almost call this category the mechanics we haven't had the chance to use yet, right? Mechanics that are unusual, give you a kaleidoscope type sense where you're like, well, I didn't know red could do that, didn't know black could do that. There's my explanation for why I have Battlefield Scavenger in the deck and in the 3rd subsection. Or is this the 1st subsection? Why did I go in reverse? Okay, anyway, Fire Prophecy. 1 colorless and a red, instant. It deals 3 damage to target creature, but you may also put a card from your hand on the bottom of your library. If you do, draw a card. So just sort of swap a card into your library, exchange it for another one. If you've scryed, that's pretty nice. But otherwise, this might be something you choose depending on when in the game you're playing this. It's scary because it lets you do card draw while also doing damage. Early in the game is nice, but late in the game is when you get the most value, when you're able to do damage and draw at the same time. Just keep that turn going, right? It's instant speed, so you can do it on the same turn as other actions. If you're doing this earlier in the game, this might be the only thing you do on your turn, but later on in the game is when this gets the big impact, and that's why I've put it in this category. Cards that get the most impact out of later on in the game. Okay, next we have Go for Blood, 1 colorless and a red sorcery. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control, and it has cycling 1. If you read the reminder text, each deals damage equal to its power to the other. Sneaky, right? If you have your commander out, this is Deathtouch damage. But if you don't, just cycle this card and use it as card draw. It's only a 1 mana cycle. If you don't have the commander out, cycling's a great option. If you do have the commander out, Deathtouch damage is a good option. I think this is an all-around cheap and useful card, especially for being scary. Next, we have Frill Scare Mentor, 2 colorless and a red for a human warrior, 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, put a menace counter on target non-human creature you control. Most cards in the deck are non-human, and this really does something. When you have menace and you have Deathtouch, and you're already a 3/2, very scary. But there's also one more rule on the card. It says, for 2 colorless and a red, tap it, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control with menace. So there's a couple cards out there. We just went through the black cards, and the last one, the Underdark Explorer, has menace. Anything that already has menace, getting that boosted, giving it some extra death touchiness is wonderful. But I think on the whole, only having to pay 2 colorless and a red for this guy, just having him by himself or with your commander, what a great combo. I mean, ultimately, maybe that's what you do, is you wait till your commander's out, play this, put the menace counter on your commander, and then every turn, since you know you'll have that amount of mana, just keep pumping up your commander. Make him bigger and bigger and bigger until he can just swing in for critical. Next up, we have Grotag Night Runner for 2 colorless and a red. It's a Goblin Rogue, 2/3. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may exile the top card of your library and play it until the end of this turn. It's a limited time frame, but with your commander out, they're going to have a pretty tough dilemma. Do they let this guy through? 2 damage, but then it also means that you get essentially a free card from the top to play for this turn, and it says you may play that card, not cast, which means if it's a land card, you can still put that on the battlefield. You might in fact want to wait to play any lands for turn until after your combat step. It'd be particularly nice if this guy had haste, but he doesn't, and that's why he's in the scary category. He's one of those things people will probably want to remove or deal with a little more urgently than some of these other when it attacks trigger cards. Yeah, I wouldn't put it into those fast mana ram cards at 2 colorless and a red, and requiring the summoning sickness to wear off, and requiring it to go through, which ideally means your commander's out. This is a better scary card than a early game card. Next, we have Rakish Air for 2 colorless and a red. It's a 2/2 vampire that says, whenever a vampire you control deals combat damage to a player, put a 1/1 counter on it. That includes your commander, and I've mentioned whenever we've seen vampires in this deck, that could give you something your opponents never see coming. And it lets you boost them every time you deal damage to a player. Same predicament we've been trying to put your opponents into with the rest of this deck. Do they block and get creature removal with the Deathtouch, or do they let it through and it's going to be even worse later on? It makes things feel so urgent in this deck. This is one of those really fast, scary decks that, I mean, it doesn't need counters. It doesn't need all these exile target creature cards in order to present this very chaotic board state where ideally your creatures and your opponent's creatures are constantly entering and leaving the battlefield. That's the goal here. So this hopefully means that people are either going to remove him or be probably sorry that they didn't. Next, we have Boiling Blood, 2 colorless and a red for an instant. Target creature attacks this turn. If able, draw a card. 3 mana to draw a card. Not that great of a rate, but keep that first part in mind. Instant speed, target creature attacks this turn if able. You'll want to wait till you have any Deathtouch or Wither-like ability. Doesn't always have to be your commander, but you'll want to wait till you have one of your many scary guys out there. Play this, and that's 2 great abilities in one. Creature removal, card draw, but not only creature removal, it's creature removal in a really nice way. They attack and you get to defend and destroy them. I think this is a fun way to play commander where you're not just doing destroy target creature with every form of creature removal. Maybe if you play this, they'll now look through their hand and have a reason to remove your commander, but then you could still block and remove with another one of your creatures. So it creates dilemmas that are a lot more interesting and still have objective benefits, but it's not just raw, crazy power. Okay, next we have Shatterskull Charger, 1 colorless, red for a giant warrior, 4/3, with kicker 2, trample haste. If it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with the 1/1 counter on it. Great, just great. I mean, 5/4 is a lot better than 4/3. It also says at the beginning of your end step, if it doesn't have a 1/1 counter on it, bounce it, return it right to its owner's hand. So very similar to Dash, except the Dash is sort of the kicker in this case. Love the way that we can sort of mindfuck people that aren't used to these mechanics, keep things very unusual maybe for people that aren't used to Magic. I like to make the decks fun even when you're reading them. Wait, how does that work again? You sort of have to read it twice. But at 1 colorless and red, pretty expensive, but trample and haste, wonderful. If you have your commander out, Trample is just one of the most amazing things. I think First Strike and Trample are almost tied for how amazing they are with Deathtouch and Synergy, but also just the fact that it keeps bouncing until you can finally get that 1/1 counter on it. I love it. I mean, it's almost like, hey, if you don't have enough mana, try again next time. Try again next time. It almost feels like you could keep mana set to the aside just for the Shatterskull Charger at a 4/3 renewable source of Trample Haste. Why not? Unless they have a surefire way to get rid of it, it's just this thing that haunts them and keeps them awake at night. Next, we have Akai Coalfinger, 1 colorless and a red. Amazing Goblin Shaman. I mean, so amazing that you can tell it's one of the few cards that doesn't share any party creature types. It's only a 2/2, but it has First Strike, activated ability, red, tap it, attacking creatures gain First Strike until end of turn. Wow, so obviously you'll play this on your turn. Give all your attacking creatures First Strike. I mean, with Deathtouch, all of your First Strikers are immediately going to go in for lethal on any creatures. But beyond that, having First Strike itself, just always printed on the card, means it's always going to destroy whoever it is that's trying to get him out. Unless your opponent has a way to counter the spell or a way to remove the creature without specifically dealing damage to it, this is a pretty tough one. If they go in, try to attack, and you defend, you're going to do the Deathtouch First Strike before they're able to do anything. This is just a bread and butter Deathtouch deck card. I highly, highly recommend it. And next, we're getting close to the end here, just 5 more in red until we get to the artifacts and lands. We have Rockslide Sorcerer, 3 colorless and a red, a human wizard. Okay, safe, back into the party mechanic. 3/3, whenever you cast an instant sorcery wizard spell, Rockslide Sorcerer deals 1 damage to any target. Interesting, so keep that in mind. Rockslide Sorcerer deals 1 damage to any target. Always wait till your commander's out there. Pay 3 in the red for this guy, and just wait. Whenever you play an instant sorcery or wizard, you can destroy any creature that you want. 1 damage to any target means that you could potentially damage planeswalkers or players. They will not go in for lethal. It does not necessarily give Rockslide Sorcerer the power that your commander has. Remember, the commander can actually destroy planeswalkers. It has Planeswalker Deathtouch. That will not happen here. This guy's just doing the 1 Deathtouch, but it reminds me of Crypt Rats, my favorite card from the deck. It lets you surgically remove things almost for free. Instants and sorceries especially. Wizards, I've mentioned, should be one of the lowest counts in the deck, but instants and sorceries, we've seen, we have mana ramp, we have card draw, we have removal, all sorts of varieties of those. Now they can do double time. Okay, next up we have Wojek Embermage for 3 colorless and a red, a human wizard, 1/2, with Radiance. Tap it, and it deals 1 damage to target creature and each other creature that shares a color with it. Sheesh. So again, we're seeing an amazing combo of these sneaky Deathtouchers. So when you tap it and you deal 1 damage to target creature and each other creature that shares a color with it, don't pick red or black. Hopefully. This is Crypt Rats without the consequence of wiping your own board. Crypt Rats, you spend black mana, deals 1 damage to every creature and player, so that's everything. Here you choose a color, and unless you're only playing against a red or black deck, in which case, here you can choose blue. And now every blue creature in the game, not just, on the opponent's battlefield, in the game, if it's a 4-player commander game, that could be a huge amount, all of them get destroyed. With your commander out there, 1 damage to every blue, every green, every white card. Very, very useful. Might be kind of rough if they only have your colors, but you'd probably be willing to do that if you need a board wipe. Okay, next up we have Aki Underminer for 3 colorless and a red. It's a 1/1 Goblin Rogue Shaman. Pretty cool combo. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player sacrifices a permanent. So it's kind of neat. I personally think that it's pretty expensive. I don't really foresee many people even playing this. This is probably one of those luxury cards that you're only going to get in the perfect game with the perfect curve and draw. But I do think that sacrificing a permanent is way funkier than it seems on the surface, right? It doesn't say creature, it doesn't say non-land, and it doesn't even call out a color. So they could be sacrificing anything on their side of the board. It could be a plains, it could be an equipment. With your Deathtoucher, with First Strike and other guys out there, this guy becomes way creepier than he sounds. I would definitely call him more creepy than scary, though. Going to be more of a tough play in most games, but I appreciate him. Being a rogue, how could I not put him in the deck? Next up, we have Song Mad Treachery, 3 colorless, red for a sorcery that says gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap it, it gains haste. So that's pretty rough, but it's a double-sided land. So on the back it says Song Mad Ruins, and you just get a mountain, enters the battlefield tapped. I think this is a decent card. You can use that gain control ability in a variety of ways, right? Hopefully you'll have a first striker. Hopefully you'll have a Death Toucher out there that could give it an extra level of oomph. But even if you don't, you could sacrifice it. You could play a card that says, as an additional cost, sacrifice a creature. Now you can sacrifice your opponent's creature, and it's no big deal. Attack, sacrifice, get a lot of value out of it. I think it's just a classic double-sided card from Zendikar, right? It's not as good as the ones that don't enter tapped, but it can give you that extra bit of win con or ramp when you need it. It definitely fits more into the scary category than the ramp category, though, because that cost is just enormous. 3 red. That's a lot. Now our final red card in this category, we have Near Heath. That's right, Near Heath Stalker. For 4 colorless in a red, that is a Vampire Rogue 4/1 with Undying. When it dies, if it had no 1/1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it. So it becomes a 5/2 on its second go round. Really love it. So there's not really ways to get rid of 1/1 counters. That could be a fun extra oomph, but right now what this presents is a rogue. It presents a vampire, right? That vampire has the little synergy where you can add 1/1 counters on it using that other card. So you want to make sure the 1/1 counter is already on it and don't put the 1/1 counter on it from your other synergy. But anyway, that's a rare use case. But I'll say the Undying is way better than you'd expect. Because you can already return cards to your hand or battlefield using some of the sorceries and instants in this deck. A 4/1, again, that's already what your commander has 4 attack. That's nice. But then it comes back as a 4/2. You could bring it back again. And every time you return it to the battlefield, it'll have no counters on it. Then the Undying triggers the next time. This guy's just going to come back and hurt. It's 4 mana in a red, so it's one of those end of the game, why don't we finish it now type cards. I do think at that cost, you'd hope it have a little more defense, but since it has Undying, just think of it as a 5/2. And it's way better that way. Okay, next up we have our final cards. These didn't fit into the 3 categories because I figured we'd keep those categories mostly limited to black and red, not principally multicolor and artifact. You could sort of fit these in there though. Like, for example, our first card here is Stormkirk Captain. This could have fit into that second category perhaps. It's a vampire soldier, first strike. Other vampire creatures you control have first strike and 1/1. Wow. So your commander's a vampire. We've talked about that vampire with the 1/1s. This guy, I don't expect you to use him unless your commander's out. Give that commander first strike. This is great. It's maybe any of the 3 categories, honestly. You would want to play this early on to maybe put someone out there that's hard to remove. You could play it middle of the game in order to get better vampire synergies when you play your commander, make it harder to deal with your commander. But you could also play it late game. I mean, it is a 2/2 first strike. Other vampires get 1/1 first strike. So late game, maybe it's a little bit underpowered, but I do think this deck is all about having bodies on the battlefield. Bodies that together make it hard to pick out which one's the most important one. This one's going to seem a lot more important than it actually is, which is how that third category, that scary stuff category, was sort of defined. And next, we have another classic card, Fire Covenant, 1 colorless, black-red for an instant. It deals X damage divided any way you choose among any number of target creatures, where X is equal to the amount of life you pay. That's right. And it says, effects that prevent or redirect this damage cannot be used to counter this loss of life. It's a Swiss Army knife, right? You play it for 3 mana, and you take down your life total however much you need to get rid of whatever it is that you need to. I highly recommend playing this in just about any deck that has black and red colors, because your life total in Commander at 40 normally, that means this is a no-brainer. You're going to play this at any time, especially earlier on. But again, just like that last Stormkirk Captain, it could fit into any of those 3 categories pretty well. Okay, let's go through the artifacts now. So we have Ruined Stalactite. It's a 1 mana equipment. Equipped creature gets 1/1 and is every creature type, and its equipped cost is 2. 1/1 could go a long way, especially with trample, and every creature type means, hello commander, come on out of the command zone. And then we have Cloak of the Bat for 2 colorless. It's an equipment that says equipped creature has flying and haste for 2 mana. So equipped 2 mana, play 2 mana. Seems very nice. You probably want to move this on to whatever creature you recently played in order to give them haste and a way to perhaps get right through. Later on in the game though, flying, I've had that get me many a time where you just need flying. You just do. And that commander, with the commander tax sometimes, if it's had to go to the zone a couple times, this is really a lifesaver when you need it. Okay, next up we have a fun one, Spare Supplies for 2 colorless. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. And it enters the battlefield tapped, but later on you can pay 2, tap it again, sacrifice it to draw another card. So Spare Supplies is not the most valuable card, but I appreciate it for what it is. You draw a card for 2, pay 2 later to draw another card. I like that. Any mana color. This is a 2-color deck, which means that some of those cards that just have 3 pips, that is scary. You do not want to have no extra mana towards the end of the game, and you have cards with flashback costs or whatever, what dash costs that you can't pay. So I think this is a lifesaver when you need it. It's kind of useless in some games. Some games you are already going to be fine with your card draw. You're already going to have these other options out there. But this is really, at Artifact, at colorless, a really good safety net. That's almost how I describe this card, a good safety net. And if you have any other mana rocks or card draw options in your collection, just take this out and put it in instead. Try out different options. I like 2 mana cost. Stick around that range and see what you can get out of a Spare Supplies card draw type mechanic. And similarly, next up we have Golden Egg for 2. It's a food, and when you enter the battlefield, you draw a card right away. No tapping. What you can do is pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice and add a mana of any color, so mana fixing, or pay 2, sacrifice it to gain 3 life, just like a normal food. So I doubt you'll be gaining life. I mean, maybe if you've been fire coveting, doing some other life loss things in your game, maybe that's going to help you out. But I really see this as a nice mana fix. You pay 2 to draw, pay 1 later to fix. That's going to come up a lot, I think. If you get this in your opening hand, I would say wonderful, right? This is exactly what you want early on in the game in order to get 1 extra card and 1 extra fix. Next, we have another Cloak, Cloak and Dagger for 2 mana. It's a rogue equipment, so that's pretty cool. Don't really think you get too much out of like that subtype, but what you do get out of it is whenever a rogue comes into play, you may attach this to it for free. So amazing. And you essentially attach it at whatever speed that card was coming into play at, not at sorcery speed. So that's really nice as well. And it says equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has Shroud, which means it can't be the target of spells or abilities. Unlike Hexproof, that means even your spells and abilities won't be able to target it. So it is kind of funky. I obviously would put this right onto a commander. You know, Zagras is a vampire rogue, so put it right onto your commander and just wreak havoc. How are they going to get rid of him? Nobody knows. But I don't know. Any rogue could use this. I like to have cheap, almost free equipments, right? You pay 2 mana earlier on in the game, and I doubt the opponent's going to think, I should get my artifact removal out. It's probably just going to sit there and be a reusable, surprising weapon that whenever you play a rogue, all of a sudden, your opponent's going to have to counter that rogue immediately or live with the fact that it has Shroud until you play another one. So I don't even think you should pay that 3 equipped cost for it. Don't even bother. Just wait till you play a rogue. Have some fun with it. Do a little bit of party action. It's party time. Next up, we have probably another familiar one, Mind Stone for 2 colorless. Tap it, add a colorless mana. Why not? You know, just give you a little bit of extra oomph and tap 1, sacrifice it to draw a card. Why not? This deck does not have as much lands as you might be expecting. It's not overflowing when it comes to mana options. And if you're not drawing those mana high speed cards that we showed in the beginning of the video, probably don't sacrifice this. You're not going to get this back from the graveyard. That's not a creature. Doesn't have anything tricky about it. So I would normally pay this, just get that mana out of it, keep it around for as long as possible, and then sacrifice it when your life is on the line and you've run out of other options. But you can do what you want with it. It's one of those cards that is in a lot of commander decks, and thus is another one you can swap out for your preferred mana rock. And our final artifact in this section, and I believe in the whole deck, is Treasure Keeper. It's 4 mana for a construct. When it dies, get this, okay? Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card with mana value 3 or less. What? You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Are you kidding me? Then put all the revealed cards not cast this way on the bottom of your library in a random order, and it's a 3/3. I love this creature. It is a Baldur's Gate creature. I think this really signifies for me Baldur's Gate. It's a set that I love some of these cards. The value of it is very hard to determine. People seem to still not know what to do with the set, but I think this is pure value. 4 colorless is great in this deck. There's a lot of cheap options, and then the expensive options normally are expensive because of the color requirements. Here, now you know what you're doing with 4 mana, something you might already know that you'll have based on your opening hand or first 2 turns. Once you put it out there, no one's going to want this thing to die, right? When you die, you immediately reveal the top of your library till you get a mana value with 3 or less. I think this is fun. I think this is something you'll want to recur from your graveyard right away if you get some graveyard recursion in your hand. I feel like this is such a underappreciated card. I think you put this right into your lineup whenever you put it in there, and it presents almost as much of a scary stuff option as your first strikers, right? They don't want this to die, and it's a 3/3 with maybe Deathtouch if your commander's out there. Any bonuses you give to it really make it that much better. This is fun. Okay, now for the final section of the video, we have lands. Starting off with the worst ones that you'll definitely want to swap out if you end up having a better option in your collection. We have Tressorhorn Sinks, a snow land, enters tapped, use it for black or red. That's just what I had. Then we have Rakdos Guildgate, enters tapped, black or red. Nice, nice. Sometimes it's good to keep the power level low. Probably these lands mean we're never going to reach 10. So if you want to play against people and you don't want them to be super scared of you, you put a couple guild gates in, right? Ultimately, if you put guild gates or any kind of gate in your deck, you'd probably want to synergize with it, have a card that says search your library for a land or gate. But that's, again, how I've kept the power level low on this deck, but at a really fun, surprising point. Then we have Tramway Station. I don't quite like this either. You have to sacrifice it in order to draw a card. So it enters tapped, you can use it for black or red, but then you have to pay practically 5 mana, sacrifice and draw a card. I like the new Capenna aesthetic. I like the new Capenna cards. I like to prioritize fun and make the deck seem to have things you wouldn't know around the corner. All of the mechanics here work with only a couple pieces in place. So just because you're delayed because you got a Tramway Station early, you should still be fine. Ideally, though, if you're worried about early plays and you have some extra mana rocks or bounce lands, substitute that in there for this. It wouldn't hurt, so it's up to you. And finally, the last land, which arguably is not that great, Bloodfell Caves. Tapped, gain a life, black or red. What else is there to say? There's not really gain life synergies in this deck, but there are quite a lot of ways to lose a life, so maybe that one life will come in handy. And then our final 2 lands, the ones that actually give you something extra out of it. We have Helion Crucible, add 1 to your mana pool, colorless, but you can tap 1 in a red and itself, so that's sort of 3 mana, to put a pressure counter on it. Later on, you do the same thing, tap a colorless and a red and tap it to remove 2 counters, sacrifice it, put a 4/4 red Helion creature token with haste onto the battlefield. So what I love about this, it just reminds me of, what is that, Arbor Dryad, a card that is a land, but it's also a creature, and people might forget about that. So you play this as early as possible in your game, right? As soon as possible, and people will maybe forget that it can turn into a creature, and then when you run out of cool creatures to play, when you run out of cards to play, when you have more than 5 mana on your board, boom, turn this into a 4/4. It doesn't say that you have to sacrifice it, so it's a 4/4 with haste forever, and with your commander, of course, you'll have the extra bonuses. I think this is a really fun, surprising card. Having lands that can turn into creatures is just something to have in almost any commander deck, I think. And then the final land, it's Blight Step Pathway. One side, it's black. On the back, it's Seer Step Pathway, and it's red. No tapping, no nothing. Looks great, feels great. Wish we could have more of these just in general. That's about that. All right, and to wrap it up, let's count the lands. Looks like we have 11 mountains and 13 swamps. Ooh, let me count that again. That's a good number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Wow. So yeah, 13 swamps, 11 mountains. We got those extra special lands totaling 6. And then we have a bunch of ramping, so it's a little gentle in general when it comes to lands, but I think that the curve on the deck is fun. I think it gives people lots to think about, lots for you to think about in terms of sequencing and ordering, and in a general, this Zagras deck I think is a home run. I think using this commander from Zendikar and focusing on some retro cards, but primarily cards since 2020, was a great challenge, and a challenge that I hope other people will also do. Let me know in the comments section if you enjoyed this and what you would do if you were building your own Zagras deck, Thief of Heartbeats. Any improvements, any sore spots, any just straight up inaccuracies. I know I haven't done an extended video like this ever, so this is one of those editing challenges, but I did my best. Subscribe for more, make sure to leave a like, and do the usual bell to get notifications. Support me on Patreon if you want to help support the funding behind these videos, help me to get more cards, help me to keep doing this. Finally, you can follow me on Twitter at InsaneJ. That's insane, but instead of the E, it's a J. And feel free to get my indie game on Steam. It's Oogie Can You Help? But you know what? Forget about it. We'll talk about that later. Thanks for coming, guys. This has been Zagras, Thief of Heartbeats. I am the Icy Funiculator. Cheers.